There's a part of your brain that wants to keep you safe at any cost. It does not care whether the threat is real. It does not pause to check the evidence. It fires first and asks questions later. And for most of human history, that was exactly the right strategy. But you do not live in the environment that part of your brain was built for. And so the very system designed to protect you can become the system that traps you in anxiety, in anger, in patterns of thought and behavior that feel impossible to escape. The question is not whether this is happening. The question is whether you can do anything about it. To understand the answer, you need to understand the relationship between two regions of your brain. They are not enemies, but they are often in tension, and the balance between them quietly shapes almost everything about how you think, feel, and respond to the world. The first region is the amygdala. It sits deep inside the brain, tucked beneath the cerebral cortex, roughly the size and shape of an almond. You have two of them, one on each side. They are ancient in evolutionary terms, present in animals far older than our species, and their core function is threat detection. When your brain perceives something that might be dangerous, the amygdala activates fast. It does not wait for the rest of your brain to catch up. Within milliseconds, it begins preparing your body to fight, flee, or freeze. Heart rate rises, stress hormones flood the bloodstream, attention narrows to the perceived threat. The world contracts to the immediate problem in front of you. This response is not a flaw. For most of evolutionary history, the cost of missing a real threat was death. The cost of mistaking a harmless thing for a threat was just wasted energy. Your amygdala evolved to be a highly sensitive early warning system, and a sensitive system is a system that sometimes misfires. That trade-off kept your ancestors alive. The second region is the prefrontal cortex. It sits at the front of your brain, just behind your forehead. It is far more recent in evolutionary terms. It is the part of your brain most associated with what we call higher-order thinking, planning, reasoning, weighing consequences, understanding other people's perspectives, regulating emotion, and making deliberate choices. The prefrontal cortex is, in a sense, what allows you to pause. Where the amygdala says react, the prefrontal cortex says wait. Where the amygdala reads threat, the prefrontal cortex can ask whether the threat is real. Where the amygdala drives the automatic, the prefrontal cortex makes space for the intentional. But here's the complication that most discussions of these two regions overlook. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are not separate systems that simply compete. They are in constant communication, and the direction of that communication is not symmetrical. When the amygdala is highly activated, when it perceives significant threat, stress, or emotional intensity, it can effectively reduce the influence of the prefrontal cortex. The signals flowing from the amygdala upward can, in moments of acute stress, diminish the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate and reflect. Neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux, whose work on fear and emotional memory helped establish much of what we understand about the amygdala, described these as fast and slow pathways. The fast pathway delivering an immediate emotional response before the slower, more considered thinking has a chance to contribute. This is sometimes called emotional hijacking, a term popularized by psychologist Daniel Goleman in his work on emotional intelligence. When your amygdala fires strongly enough, the careful reasoning part of your brain temporarily steps back. You say something you later regret. You freeze when you mean to act. You spiral into worry before you've had a chance to assess whether the worry is warranted. These are not moral failures. They are not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. They are the natural result of a nervous system doing its job, sometimes too well, in contexts it was not designed for. Anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress, and various difficulties with emotional regulation involve, to varying degrees, disruptions in this amygdala-prefrontal relationship. In chronic anxiety, the amygdala tends to respond more strongly and more frequently to stimuli that a well-regulated nervous system might treat as manageable. In depression, the pattern is more complex. Reduced prefrontal activity can affect motivation, decision-making, and the ability to interrupt cycles of negative thinking. In trauma, the amygdala can remain highly sensitized long after the original threat has passed, flagging cues in the present environment as dangerous because they resemble elements of a past experience that truly was dangerous. The psychologist Martin Seligman and colleagues identified what happens when people repeatedly encounter situations they feel they cannot control, a state he called learned helplessness. When the brain learns that its actions do not produce reliable outcomes, it begins to disengage. The prefrontal cortex, which depends on some sense of agency to function well, becomes less active. Hopelessness is not merely a feeling, it changes the brain's behavior. But the relationship between these systems is not fixed. This is where the evidence becomes genuinely important. Neuroscience has demonstrated that the brain retains a degree of plasticity throughout life, the capacity to change its structure and function in response to experience. This does not mean the brain is infinitely malleable or that any negative pattern can simply be rewired by choosing to think differently. The claims made in some popular self-help content about neuroplasticity are often overstated, but the evidence does support something meaningful. Consistent practices appear to change the functional relationship between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex over time. Mindfulness meditation is one of the most studied examples. Researcher Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School found that long-term meditators showed structural differences in areas of the brain associated with attention and interoception compared to non-meditators. Studies using brain imaging have also found that mindfulness-based practices are associated with reduced amygdala reactivity and increased prefrontal activity during emotional challenges. The mechanism appears to involve training the brain to observe its own reactions without immediately identifying with them, creating a small but significant gap between stimulus and response. Cognitive reappraisal is another evidence-supported approach. This involves deliberately changing the way you interpret an emotionally charged situation, not by denying the emotion, but by considering it from a different angle. Research by psychologist James Gross at Stanford found that people who habitually use cognitive reappraisal as an emotional regulation strategy tend to experience less negative emotion, report greater well-being, and show patterns of brain activity consistent with stronger prefrontal regulation. Reappraisal is not positive thinking. It is the practice of asking whether the meaning you have assigned to a situation is the only meaning available. Physical exercise also appears to play a role. Regular aerobic activity has been associated in multiple studies with reductions in anxiety and improvements in mood, and there is evidence suggesting it influences brain-derived neurotropic protein, a protein involved in the growth and maintenance of neurons, particularly in regions relevant to emotional regulation and memory. Sleep is less glamorous but arguably more important. During sleep, the brain consolidates memory, processes emotional experiences, and restores the prefrontal cortex's capacity for regulation. A single night of significantly disrupted sleep measurably increases amygdala reactivity the following day. The researcher Matthew Walker has documented extensively how sleep deprivation effectively decouples the amygdala from prefrontal regulation, leaving people more emotionally reactive, less able to tolerate frustration, and more prone to catastrophic interpretations of neutral events. And then there is the practice that philosophy has long recommended and neuroscience is beginning to investigate: reflection. Deliberately examining your own thoughts in writing, in conversation with a trusted person, or simply in quiet contemplation appears to support the kind of self-awareness that the prefrontal cortex makes possible. When you name an emotion, activity in the language processing regions of the prefrontal cortex tends to increase, and amygdala activity tends to decrease. The psychologist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA described this as affect labeling. Putting feelings into words changes how the brain processes them. None of this means that strengthening prefrontal regulation will make you calm in every situation, eliminate emotional pain, or resolve the structural causes of mental health difficulties. Chronic stress, unprocessed trauma, inadequate social support, and conditions requiring professional treatment are not addressed by mindfulness practice alone. The evidence for these approaches exists in one larger picture, and that larger picture includes the limits of individual effort. What the evidence does suggest is this: the prefrontal cortex is not a fixed quantity that you either have or lack. It is a capacity that responds to how you use it. Like any capacity, it can be developed, not by suppressing the amygdala, which is neither possible nor desirable, because your emotional responses contain real information about your needs, your values, and your environment, but by gradually increasing the prefrontal cortex's capacity to stay present alongside those responses rather than being overrun by them. The philosopher William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, argued that the ability to return your attention voluntarily to something important again and again was the root of good character, sound reasoning, and practical freedom. He believed it could be cultivated through effort. He called it the essential voluntary act of the will. He did not have brain imaging technology, but the basic insight that the capacity to redirect your attention is trainable and that training it matters is one that both philosophy and neuroscience, from very different directions, appeared to support. Your brain is not fighting itself because something went wrong. It is doing exactly what brains do, running fast systems designed for an older world alongside slower systems trying to navigate a newer one. The gap between those two systems is not a defect. It is the space where deliberate change becomes possible. The question is not whether your amygdala will fire. It will. The question is whether the part of you that can pause, reflect, and choose will be strong enough, practiced enough, present enough to meet it there. That gap between stimulus and response, small as it sometimes is where you live, and it can be widened.